Your smartwatch might know you are going into an adrenal crisis up to 7 weeks before you actually feel the crash. We spend so much time talking about how unpredictable adrenal insufficiency is, how a perfectly manageable Tuesday suddenly turns into a terrifying Wednesday for no apparent reason. But recent data from Mount Sinai suggests the body is actually screaming at us through subtle nervous system changes long before the visible symptoms hit. We just haven't been looking at the right translation.
The phrase that always strikes me is the illusion of suddenness. When someone with Addison's disease or secondary adrenal insufficiency crashes, it feels like falling off a cliff. But what the wearable data is starting to show us, and what the My Adrenal Life article really digs into, is that you actually didn't fall off a cliff. You were walking down a steepening gradient for days, maybe weeks. Your heart rate variability was dropping, your resting heart rate was climbing, your sleep architecture was fracturing. The body was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. It is just that cortisol regulates so many background processes that when the HPA axis is suppressed or damaged, the autonomic nervous system takes the hit first before the profound physical fatigue sets in.
That shifts the entire paradigm of how we treat chronic illness. If the crash is the final stage of a multi-day physiological cascade, then tracking symptoms isn't enough. By the time you log fatigue, the house is already on fire.
Exactly. Tracking symptoms alone is inherently reactive. You're just writing down that you are already in pain or already exhausted. What the wearable data introduces, and I want to be careful here because an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring is not measuring cortisol, is a proxy measurement of the physiological strain caused by that lack of cortisol. It is measuring the body's cardiovascular and nervous system response to stress. For a healthy person, their autonomic nervous system shifts back and forth between sympathetic, which is fight or flight, and parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. When you have adrenal insufficiency, that shifting mechanism is fundamentally broken. The stress response gets stuck in overdrive because there is no appropriate cortisol spike to manage the metabolic demand. And that shows up in the heart rate data way before you cognitively realize you are running on empty.
But a wearable is a blunt instrument. It measures heartbeats, not hormones. How does a patient actually distinguish between a normal tired day and an impending adrenal flare just by looking at a wristband?
The key is understanding personal baselines. The article highlights this beautifully. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they first get a wearable is comparing their numbers to the general population. They see an HRV of 30 and think they are failing at health. But in chronic illness, and specifically in adrenal insufficiency where the autonomic nervous system is altered, your normal is strictly your own. A 2025 study on inflammatory conditions and wearables found that circadian features of HRV, along with resting heart rate, actually differentiated inflammatory flares from remission up to 4 weeks in advance. The absolute number matters far less than the deviation from your personal average. If your baseline HRV is 25 and suddenly it drops to 15 for 3 consecutive nights, that is the canary in the coal mine. It is the body signaling that the current metabolic demand is exceeding the available resources, which in this case means you might be under-replaced on your hydrocortisone or fludrocortisone, or you are fighting off a subclinical infection.
That requires a massive amount of self-awareness. It means looking at the data not as a diagnostic tool, but as a language you have to learn to speak.
It is entirely a translation exercise, and that is where the structured tracking comes into play. It is not enough to just look at the Garmin stress score and say, well, my body battery is low today. You have to correlate it. Let us say you go to the grocery store on Monday. It feels fine, you carry the bags in, you feel okay. Tuesday, you wake up and your resting heart rate is up 5 beats per minute. Wednesday, you wake up and you cannot lift your head off the pillow. Without the data, you think Wednesday's crash came out of nowhere. With the data, you can look back and see that the physical exertion of Monday triggered a physiological debt that your body could not pay back because your cortisol dosing was fixed, but your physical demand was elevated. The data bridges the gap between action and consequence, which in adrenal insufficiency can often be separated by 24 to 48 hours.
Wait. I'm getting stuck on the timeline here. If I exercise today, my muscles hurt tomorrow. That is a direct, observable biological consequence. Are you saying the endocrine system has a 48-hour lag time before it registers a deficit?
It is not that the endocrine system takes 48 hours to register the deficit. The deficit happens immediately. The delay is in how long the body can compensate using other systems before it completely runs out of cellular energy. When cortisol is low, your body starts pulling on adrenaline and noradrenaline to keep your blood pressure up and your heart pumping. You are essentially running on emergency backup generators. You feel fine or maybe just slightly wired and anxious because adrenaline is doing the heavy lifting, but adrenaline is not meant to sustain long-term cellular metabolism. It is a short-term survival hormone. Once the adrenaline gets depleted, the physiological scaffolding collapses. That is the crash you feel on Wednesday. The wearable catches the adrenaline compensation on Tuesday. It sees the elevated heart rate, the suppressed HRV, the lack of deep sleep, because the sympathetic nervous system is screaming. By the time the physical fatigue hits, the compensation mechanisms have simply failed.
That explains the wired and tired phenomenon. The patient feels jittery, but exhausted because the nervous system is flooring the gas pedal, while the gas tank is completely empty.
That is exactly the mechanism. And that is why HRV is such a critical metric here. Heart rate variability is the literal measurement of the tug-of-war between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. When the body is healthy and recovered, there is high variability between heartbeats because the parasympathetic system is actively braking the heart rate. When the body is under profound physiological strain, the sympathetic system takes total control, the heart beats like a metronome, and HRV plummets. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, a plummeting HRV combined with a rising resting heart rate over multiple days is almost a guaranteed precursor to a flare. Researchers looking at wearable data in intensive care patients actually found that reduced HRV is strongly associated with adrenal insufficiency and autonomic dysfunction, and that HRV improves once steroids are administered. The data proves the biological recomplexification that happens when the body gets the cortisol it needs.
I hear the utility of this, but I have to push back on the psychological cost. When you give a chronically ill patient a device that constantly tells them their nervous system is failing, do you not just create a vicious cycle of anxiety? The patient sees a low HRV, panics about an impending crash, and that panic inherently burns more cortisol, causing the exact crash they were trying to avoid.
That is a very real, very dangerous trap. The nocebo effect is powerful, and data exhaustion is a legitimate phenomenon. The My Adrenal Life article specifically addresses this. Tracking can become obsessive, and when it crosses from being a tool for empowerment into a source of hypervigilance, it is actively harmful. But we have to look at the alternative. The alternative is living in a body that feels entirely unpredictable, where a crash feels like a random punishment from the universe. For many patients, the anxiety of not knowing why they are sick is far worse than the anxiety of looking at a bad sleep score. The data actually provides a bizarre form of comfort. It validates their reality. When you wake up feeling like you were hit by a truck and the doctors have been telling you that your labs look fine, seeing a wearable objectively confirm that your physiological stress markers are off the charts is deeply validating. It takes the blame away from the patient. It proves this is a biological event, not a psychological failing.
Validation is powerful, but validation does not write a prescription. How does a patient actually take a printout of an Apple Watch graph to an endocrinologist and not get laughed out of the office?
That is the hardest part of this entire process. There's a massive communication gap between the lived experience of a patient and the clinical framework of a physician. A doctor has 10 minutes with you. They're trained to look at discrete blood tests, not continuous behavioral data. If you walk in and say, "My Garmin says my stress is high," they will likely dismiss it as consumer tech noise. But if you walk in with structured data, which is what the tracking sheets in the My Adrenal Life group are designed to do, you change the nature of the conversation. You do not present the wearable data in isolation. You present it as a correlation matrix. You say, over the last 3 months, every time my resting heart rate rises above 80 for 2 consecutive days, I experience profound orthostatic hypotension and vomiting on the 3rd day. You are speaking their language now. You are presenting a reproducible relationship between physiological markers and clinical symptoms.
I do not know. That still feels too clean to me. A busy doctor is going to look at that and say, well, you were probably just dehydrated.
Some will. We cannot pretend that bringing data to a doctor magically fixes medical gaslighting. A lot of physicians are actively resistant to patient-generated health data because it falls outside of their traditional diagnostic training. A survey of physicians regarding wearable devices found that they are primarily interested in using the data to check if patients are complying with treatments, not necessarily to discover new physiological insights. But the landscape is shifting incredibly fast. We are seeing major academic institutions using wearable sensors to predict disease flares. Gastroenterologists at Mount Sinai are using Oura rings and Apple Watches to predict inflammatory bowel disease flares up to 7 weeks before they happen, based purely on autonomic nervous system changes. The precedent is being set in other chronic illnesses. Adrenal insufficiency is just lagging behind in the clinical literature. By meticulously tracking this data now, patients are essentially crowdsourcing the clinical trials of the future. They are proving that subjective symptoms have objective, measurable precursors.
That is a fascinating pivot. The patient stops being just a passive recipient of care and becomes an active researcher of their own condition. But that requires a level of emotional detachment from the data. You have to look at your own suffering like a scientist.
It requires an enormous amount of compartmentalization, and truthfully, nobody does it perfectly. There are weeks where you track every metric, you log every milligram of medication, you note the weather, your hydration, your emotional stress, and then there are weeks where you just take the watch off because looking at it makes you want to throw it across the room. Both approaches are valid. The goal of tracking is not to achieve perfect health. Adrenal insufficiency is a chronic, lifelong condition. You are not going to biohack your way out of a broken HPA axis. The goal of tracking is simply to increase the size of the window between stimulus and response. If you know that a certain pattern of sleep disruption always leads to a flare, you can preemptively adjust your life. You cancel the dinner plans, you preemptively hydrate. Maybe you discuss stress dosing with your medical team before the crash actually happens. You move from being the victim of the disease to being the manager of the disease.
It is about finding agency in an inherently powerless situation. The data gives you a locus of control.
Exactly, and it changes the internal narrative. When you have an invisible illness, the hardest person to convince that you are actually sick is often yourself. You push yourself to do normal things because you look normal, and then you crash, and you feel immense guilt. You think, why cannot I just handle a trip to the store? The wearable data provides a profound emotional release from that guilt. It shows you the math. It says you cannot handle the trip to the store because your heart rate is 110 beats per minute while standing still, and your nervous system is in a state of sheer panic. It allows you to offer yourself grace. That is the quietest, but maybe the most important benefit of all this tracking. It is a daily reminder that your body is not failing you out of weakness. It is working incredibly hard just to keep you upright. Understanding those small, quiet hints your body gives you is the first step toward building a sustainable life with this disease.
It is a map. It does not change the terrain, but it stops you from walking off the cliff blindly. For anyone wanting to dig into the granular details of how to actually structure this data for your medical team, the full article and the free tracking sheets are available in the My Adrenal Life Facebook group. If this conversation helped you connect a few dots about your own body, share it with someone else who might be staring at their smartwatch, wondering what it all means.